The night hums with energy, a cocktail of jazz, smoke, and sin. Neon lights flicker off rain-slick streets while men in tailored suits disappear into backroom clubs, exchanging envelopes, promises, and bullets. This is the city that never sleeps, but beneath its rhythm lies another heartbeat. Quieter, more deliberate. It belongs to one man who would change the rules of crime forever. He was born Salvatore Lucania, but the world would come to know him as Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who didn't just play the game, he reinvented it. To most, he was a criminal. To those who understood power, he was something far more dangerous, an architect. Luciano looked at chaos and saw a system waiting to be built. At a time when New York's underworld was splintered into warring tribes, Italians against Jews, Irish against everyone, Luciano imagined unity. Not through loyalty or honor, but through profit. His genius wasn't in violence. It was in organization. He turned the Mafia from a family of criminals into a corporation of crime. In a world ruled by greed and fear, he offered structure, a hierarchy where every racket had a ledger, every murder had a reason, and every decision had a cost. But this story isn't just about crime. It's about vision. How one man saw the future of power when everyone else was still playing by old-world codes. It's about the collision between ambition and morality, and how a poor Sicilian immigrant built an empire that would outlast him by generations. In the smoke-filled rooms of Prohibition-era Manhattan, Luciano was already thinking decades ahead. He watched gangsters waste fortunes over turf wars and vendettas. He saw bosses clinging to pride while their empires burned. Where others saw chaos, he saw inefficiency. And inefficiency, in his mind, was weakness. So he studied. He observed. He learned from Wall Street brokers, corrupt politicians, and businessmen who wore respectability like armor. Luciano realized that power wasn't about bullets, it was about control. Control of supply, demand, loyalty, and fear. What he built was not merely a criminal network. It was an invisible infrastructure that stretched from New York to Havana, from Chicago to Sicily. Yet behind this transformation lay a paradox. The same man who dreamed of order lived by violence. The man who united men through profit would be betrayed by them in the end. The architect of the Mafia's golden age would one day find himself exiled, alone, a king without a kingdom. His story is both a triumph and a tragedy. A portrait of power's seductive pull and the inevitable decay it brings. To understand Lucky Luciano is to understand the evolution of crime itself. Before him, gangsters were thugs, loud, impulsive, reckless. After him, they were executives. He replaced street justice with boardroom discipline, vendettas with management strategy. Even the government, in its war against crime, had to study his methods. He had built something too intelligent to destroy, too structured to vanish. But behind every system lies a human soul, restless, calculating, afraid. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the shadows around him. Friends became rivals. Trust became currency. And every decision he made carried a quiet cost. The higher he climbed, the more fragile his world became. This is not a story of good versus evil. It's the story of order versus chaos, and the man who tried to control both. From the slums of the Lower East Side to the marble suites of Manhattan's finest hotels, Lucky Luciano's journey is the story of modern organized crime. Its birth, its brilliance, and its inevitable corruption. Tonight, we step into his world, a world where loyalty is an illusion, power is temporary, and every victory comes with a price. Because when you build the future of the Mafia, the one thing you can't control is how it remembers you. Before Lucky Luciano ever dreamed of empire, New York's underworld was a battlefield without generals, a chaotic sprawl of gangs clawing for survival, power, and territory. The Prohibition era had turned the city into a gold rush of illegal opportunity. Whiskey flowed through alleys, blood spilled over corners, and every man with a pistol thought he could be king. But beneath the glamour of speakeasies and jazz clubs lay a world rotting from within. a lawless frontier crying out for someone to bring order to the madness. In the early 1920s, organized crime wasn't organized at all. The Italian underworld was divided between Sicilian traditionalists and the newer American-born criminals. Each family ran its operations like a private fiefdom, answering to no one but their own vanity and greed. Every insult sparked a vendetta. Every territory dispute ended in blood. There was no central authority, no rules beyond survival. What connected these men wasn't loyalty, it was mutual distrust. The Irish mobs controlled the docks, the police, and much of the city's politics. The Jewish gangs handled the numbers racket, smuggling, and money laundering. The Italians, still struggling for a foothold, were splintered by regional loyalties. Neapolitans refused to work with Sicilians. Calabrians despised both. It was a criminal Tower of Babel, profitable for some, deadly for most. In this world of smoke and gunfire, a man's reputation meant everything. Fear was currency. To survive, you needed allies, but to trust anyone was to sign your death warrant. Street corners became kingdoms. Every bootleg shipment was a war waiting to happen. The old Sicilian code of omerta, silence, and loyalty was revered, but only in theory. In practice, betrayal came cheaper than whiskey. At the heart of this chaos was prohibition, the government's greatest gift to the underworld. The Volstead Act, passed in 1920, made alcohol illegal and instantly turned bootlegging into America's most profitable black market. Suddenly, small-time crooks became millionaires overnight. Trucks carried barrels of Canadian whiskey disguised as milk deliveries. Politicians took bribes to look away. Cops drank the same booze they were paid to confiscate. New York, once the city of opportunity, became a carnival of corruption. But the real problem wasn't the law, it was the lack of order. There were too many gangs, too many bosses, and too much pride. The Mafia families of the old country operated with a rigid hierarchy. In America, they had no such discipline. The old Sicilian dons still clung to the idea of honor, a relic of a world that didn't exist anymore. The younger generation, raised on the streets of New York, spoke a different language: money. The result was predictable: endless wars. Between 1920 and 1930, more than 500 mob killings took place in New York alone. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, kidnappings. Violence was the only form of negotiation. The newspapers called it the underworld plague. To the public, it was entertainment. To the gangsters, it was a slow-motion suicide. Among the Italian mobsters, two names ruled the decade: Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were old-world dons who demanded tribute, obedience, and blood. Their feud, later known as the Castellamarese War, would drown New York in chaos. Under their command, dozens of soldiers were gunned down in restaurants, barbershops, and tenement hallways. They fought not for the future, but for ego, each claiming to be the true boss of all bosses. This was the world Luciano was born into, a world where leadership meant survival by instinct, not vision. He watched as men he admired died over nothing. He saw fortunes built in weeks and destroyed overnight. He understood that the Mafia's greatest enemy wasn't the police or the government. It was itself. To the outside world, these mob wars looked like mere crime stories. To Luciano, they were symptoms of a broken system. He studied them like a strategist dissecting failure. Every shooting, every betrayal, every headline taught him one lesson: chaos is bad for business. He began to see the underworld not as a collection of gangs, but as an unstructured market, a potential empire without leadership. Luciano's brilliance lay in recognizing that the Mafia didn't need another tyrant. It needed a system. The streets were crowded with men who could kill, but empty of men who could think. What if, he wondered, the Mafia could be run like a corporation? What if the same principles that govern Wall Street, structure, hierarchy, profit sharing, could govern the underworld? While other gangsters boasted about how many men they'd killed, Luciano studied how power moved. He learned from politicians, observing how corruption flowed upward, not sideways. He learned from businessmen, understanding the art of delegation. He saw that success depended on stability, not dominance. But the old dons, men like Masuria and Maranzano, didn't understand this new vision. They believed in tradition, not evolution. They ruled by fear and superstition, not strategy. To them, Luciano's ideas were blasphemy. To Luciano, their ignorance was fatal. As the Prohibition years dragged on, Luciano began to form his own alliances, quiet ones. He met in secret with men outside his own ethnic circle. Meyer Lansky, the Jewish financial genius, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the volatile enforcer. Together, they imagined something radical, a new kind of underworld built on efficiency, cooperation, and modern business logic. While the rest of New York tore itself apart, Luciano was already building the foundations of a new world. He understood that the future belonged not to the most feared gangster, but to the smartest one. The streets of New York in those years were loud with the sound of Tommy guns and sirens. But in the shadows, a quiet revolution was beginning. The old ways were dying. They just didn't know it yet. Luciano would be the man to bury them. He was born Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in Lercara Fritti, a dusty Sicilian village carved into the rocky heart of Italy's underbelly. His father, Antonio, was a sulfur miner who dreamed of a better life across the ocean. Like countless immigrants of the early 20th century, the Lucania family packed their hopes into a few wooden crates and boarded a ship bound for America. They arrived in New York City in 1906, penniless, exhausted, but determined. The Lucanias settled on the Lower East Side, one of the most overcrowded neighborhoods in the country. Tenement buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. The air smelled of coal smoke, sewage, and ambition. Here, in the narrow alleys of Mulberry Street, young Salvatore learned the first truth of his life. Survival wasn't a right, it was a hustle. The boy who would become Lucky Luciano didn't have the luxury of innocence. He went to school during the day and worked at night, shining shoes, running errands, anything that paid a few cents. But poverty wasn't the only thing that shaped him. The streets were full of gangs, Irish, Jewish, and Italian, each carving their territory with fists and knives. For a Sicilian kid with no connections, joining one was less about rebellion and more about survival. By the age of 10, Luciano had already learned how to read people, their tells, their weaknesses, their motives. He could spot fear faster than most could smell danger. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was sharp, calculating even then. Unlike other boys, he didn't fight for pride. He fought for purpose. Every move was a lesson in control. Around 13, he met another street kid, quiet, serious, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Meyer Lansky. Their friendship would become one of the most important alliances in organized crime history. Lansky, a Jewish immigrant from Poland, was Luciano's mirror, equally poor, equally ambitious, but with a mind made for numbers. Where Luciano saw opportunity, Lansky saw systems. Together, they understood something most gangsters never did. Business was more powerful than bullets. But before they could dream of empires, they had to survive the jungle. Luciano joined a small-time Italian gang and started running errands for local racketeers. He smuggled cigarettes, delivered messages, collected debts. He wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention. He blended in, listened, learned. Even at 16, he carried himself like someone twice his age. Then came Prohibition's precursor, the teenage hustle that gave him his first taste of power. Luciano began offering protection to his classmates. For a small fee, he'd make sure no one else picked on them. It was an early glimpse of his genius, control through incentive. Even the teachers noticed the strange calm around him. He didn't brag, didn't bully, he managed. By his late teens, Luciano had already drifted toward the adult criminal world. He started running with men tied to Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, one of the city's most powerful Italian mobsters. Masuria's operations specialized in bootlegging and extortion, and young Luciano quickly became invaluable. He was charming, diplomatic, and ruthless when needed, a rare combination in the cutthroat world of street crime. But what truly set him apart was his mindset. Most gangsters live day to day, chasing quick money and temporary power. Luciano thought long-term. He understood that loyalty wasn't built on fear. It was built on shared profit. He treated his crew like partners, not underlings, in a world ruled by pride that made him dangerous. Still, Luciano was no saint. His rise was paved with violence. He learned early that respect in New York came from reputation, and reputation came from fear. The streets demanded proof, and Luciano gave it. He fought, he schemed, and when necessary, he killed. But he never killed without purpose. His violence was precise, strategic, an instrument of control, not chaos. During his early 20s, Luciano began working with the city's most infamous gangsters, men like Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain of Broadway. Rothstein wasn't just a gambler. He was the businessman behind the entire criminal economy of the 1920s. He fixed the 1919 World Series, financed bootlegging rings, and lent money to half the mobsters in New York. Rothstein became Luciano's unofficial mentor, teaching him how to blend crime with commerce, how to think like a banker in a world of killers. From Rothstein, Luciano learned the golden rule: don't get caught up in blood, get caught up in business. Those words would shape his entire empire. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was already one of the most respected figures on the streets. He dressed immaculately, tailored suits, silk ties, a cigarette always between his fingers. He spoke softly, smiled often, and carried the calm of a man who didn't need to prove himself. The nickname Lucky came after a brutal attack in 1929 when he was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach, yet miraculously survived. Some said he made a deal with his attackers. Others said fate had chosen him. Either way, the legend was born. The incident changed him. The near-death experience sharpened his sense of destiny. He began to see himself as untouchable, not through superstition, but through vision. Surviving that night wasn't luck, it was validation. He believed he was meant for something larger, not just to run rackets, but to restructure power itself. The Lower East Side had forged him, the poverty, the violence, the endless struggle. But Luciano was done being a street kid. He had seen the top, the speakeasies, the politicians, the businessmen in their penthouses, and he understood that true power didn't live on the streets. It lived in the rooms where deals were made and futures decided. And so, quietly, methodically, Lucky Luciano began to climb. He stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a general. The days of petty hustles were over. Ahead lay a new kind of war, one that wouldn't be fought with guns, but with alliances, betrayals, and vision. The boy from Sicily had learned how to survive. Now, he was ready to rule. By the late 1920s, New York City was alive with contradictions, a place where gangsters dined beside politicians, where the rhythm of jazz drowned out the echoes of gunfire. It was a city intoxicated by power, money, and the illusion of control. Lucky Luciano moved through this world like a shadow with purpose, calm, confident, and endlessly observant. He had climbed from the filth of the Lower East Side into the smoky parlors of Manhattan's elite underworld. But what made him different wasn't his rise, it was what he was learning along the way. Luciano had begun to understand that brute force could win battles, but strategy won empires. The old Sicilian bosses still ruled by fear and tradition, clinging to outdated codes brought over from the old country. They demanded blind obedience, spoke only in Sicilian, and despised cooperation with anyone outside their bloodline. To them, the Mafia was sacred, an inheritance, not an institution. But Luciano had grown up in America, and he saw the streets through a different lens. Here, loyalty wasn't born in Sicily, it was bought in New York. Money, not ancestry, was the language of power. He began to realize that success in this new world required a new kind of thinking, one that transcended ethnicity, pride, and superstition. That realization found form in his partnership with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, two Jewish gangsters whose ambitions mirrored his own. Lansky was quiet, analytical, and calculating. the mind of an accountant inside the body of a chess player. Siegel, in contrast, was the flame, unpredictable, magnetic, and dangerously charming. Together, they represented the perfect balance: intellect, muscle, and vision. For Luciano, these friendships were revolutionary. The Sicilian bosses sneered at the idea of working with Jews or Irishmen. They called it betrayal. Luciano called it evolution. He understood that crime, like business, needed diversity to survive. The Italians controlled the unions and labor rackets. The Jews handled finance, smuggling, and distribution. The Irish had the cops and the politicians in their pockets. Separate, they were limited. Together, they could run an empire. Late-night meetings between these young visionaries became the seeds of a new order. They gathered in back rooms of speakeasies, dimly lit by single bulbs, with whiskey flowing and cigars burning low. They spoke not of vendettas or honor, but of logistics, territories, transportation routes, supply chains, and profit margins. They were, in essence, laying down the blueprint of what would later be called modern organized crime. Luciano began to absorb not just street wisdom, but business intelligence. He watched how legitimate enterprises operated, the structure, the hierarchy, the efficiency. He studied corporations, mimicking their methods: delegation, accountability, and profit sharing. He treated his crew like employees, paying them fair cuts, keeping records, and even rewarding loyalty. For the first time, the underworld was being managed like a company. His mentor, Arnold Rothstein, had once told him the difference between a gambler and a businessman is organization. Luciano took that lesson to heart. He envisioned an underworld that didn't just react to opportunity, it created it. Every racket, every shipment, every bribe would operate under a coordinated system. No wasted motion, no unnecessary violence, just profit. At the same time, Luciano was mastering another language: politics. He learned that the most powerful men in New York didn't carry guns, they signed papers. Judges, district attorneys, and city officials were as much a part of the underworld as the gangsters themselves, only better dressed. Luciano began cultivating them carefully, buying favors with cash, protection, and silence. He created what he later called a balance of respect, a quiet understanding between the law and the lawless. But his modern thinking made him enemies. The old world dons, especially Joe the Boss Masuria, saw Luciano's methods as dangerous. Masuria was a relic from Sicily, a man who believed leadership was earned through bloodshed, not negotiation. He expected absolute obedience and treated Luciano like a son who needed discipline. But Luciano was no longer a boy. He was a strategist playing a longer game. He began to drift from Masuria's control, secretly aligning with Salvatore Maranzano, Masuria's bitter rival. Maranzano promised reform, structure, discipline, respect, but Luciano knew he was simply another old man clinging to outdated ideals. Still, he played along, manipulating both sides, gathering intelligence, and waiting for his moment. The streets, meanwhile, were on fire. The Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between Masuria's and Maranzano's factions, was tearing the Mafia apart. Bodies piled up in alleys, restaurants, and even barbershops. To Luciano, it was insanity. Two old men fighting over an empire they didn't know how to run. In public, he played the loyal soldier. In private, he was already plotting the war's end. He realized that to build the future, he first had to destroy the past. The Mafia could no longer be ruled by fear and ego. It needed a system, not a king. Luciano's meetings with Lansky and Siegel became more strategic. They began drafting the framework for something revolutionary. A commission, a council that would govern all Mafia families equally, settle disputes peacefully, and divide profits fairly. No single man would ever again hold absolute power. The age of the boss of bosses would be over. This idea was more than practical. It was visionary. Luciano saw that the Mafia didn't have to mimic the failures of monarchies or dictatorships. It could operate like the American government itself, a network of families bound by rules, balance, and order. For a man born in Sicily and forged on New York streets, This was nothing short of genius. Still, every revolution requires a betrayal. Luciano knew that to create this new order, he would have to kill the very men who had taught him the old one. It wasn't a matter of revenge, it was necessity. The old guard had to die so that his vision could live. And so, quietly, he began moving his pieces. Allies here, informants there, whispers in the dark. He smiled at Masuria's company, toasted his success, and planned his execution. Every handshake was a mask. Every conversation, a calculation. Luciano wasn't just learning the language of power, he was rewriting its grammar. For him, violence wasn't chaos, it was punctuation. Each act precise, each move deliberate. He wasn't building a criminal empire, he was designing an institution, one that would outlast names, borders, and generations. The world was about to change. And when it did, Lucky Luciano would not just rule it, he would define it. The year was 1930, and New York City's underworld had become a pressure cooker ready to explode. Behind the closed doors of cigar-scented restaurants and speakeasies, whispers of betrayal and blood filled the air. Two aging titans, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were locked in a savage war for control of the Italian Mafia. Their soldiers roamed the city like wolves, and every night another body dropped. It wasn't just a turf war. It was a civil war that threatened to destroy the very foundation of organized crime in America. To most gangsters, it was business as usual. But to Lucky Luciano, it was madness. He saw two relics of a dying world clawing at each other for an empire that no longer existed. Both men were trapped in the past, bound by old Sicilian superstition, by the myth of the boss of bosses. Luciano understood something they didn't. A kingdom built on fear was doomed to fall. Yet to bring his new vision to life, he first had to survive, and then he had to eliminate the old world entirely. Luciano's position was dangerous. Officially, he was still Masuria's protege, his golden boy. Unofficially, he was already conspiring behind his back. It was a delicate dance of deception. Smile in the presence of one man, while secretly making deals with his rival. He played the part of the loyal lieutenant so convincingly that neither Masuria nor Maranzano suspected the truth, that Luciano planned to remove them both. Masuria ruled through fear. His headquarters, a dark restaurant on Coney Island, was a temple of arrogance. He extorted, he demanded, he insulted. To him, the Mafia was a monarchy, and he was the king. But his empire was cracking. The younger generation, Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, Genovese, was growing impatient. They wanted organization, not chaos. They wanted business, not blood. Maranzano, on the other hand, was a student of history. He fancied himself a Caesar, a man destined to bring order through hierarchy. He spoke in grand metaphors, quoting Roman generals as if he were reciting scripture. When he looked at Luciano, he saw potential. He promised reform, unity, and structure. But beneath the poetry, he was just another tyrant in waiting. He wanted the Mafia to be an army, with himself as the unquestioned emperor. Luciano saw through both men. He understood that neither chaos nor dictatorship could sustain an empire. What he envisioned was something entirely new, a council-based system where power was distributed, not hoarded. But to birth that future, he would have to stage a revolution in blood. The Castellamarese war dragged on for nearly 2 years. The streets ran red. Over 100 men were killed. Restaurants became battlefields, cars exploded, and every handshake carried the weight of suspicion. Luciano moved between factions like a ghost, gathering information, feeding lies to both sides, all while protecting his own network in silence. Then came the moment that would change everything. In April 1931, Luciano arranged a peace meeting between Masuria and himself at a small Italian restaurant in Coney Island, Nuova Villa Tamaro. The story goes that the two men dined together, playing cards over a plate of pasta and wine. Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, Joe the Boss lay dead, slumped over the table, a pistol still in his hand. The assassins were Luciano's men, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The new generation had struck down the old. Luciano's betrayal was not personal. It was strategic. The death of Mafia was the death of the old Mafia. With Mafia gone, Luciano turned his attention to Maranzano. At first, he appeared to honor him, kneeling as a loyal soldier and accepting Maranzano's declaration that he was now the boss of bosses. But Luciano understood that no man could truly hold that title and live long. Within months, Maranzano began plotting against him, fearing his influence and ambition. He ordered Luciano's assassination. What Maranzano didn't realize was that Luciano had already infiltrated his ranks. His spies brought word of the plot, and Luciano moved first. On September 10, 1931, a group of killers disguised as police officers entered Maranzano's Park Avenue office. They announced a raid. Before Maranzano could speak, they drew their guns and knives. Moments later, the self-proclaimed Caesar lay dying on his office floor, stabbed and shot to death. The old order was gone. The age of autocrats had ended. That night, Luciano met privately with his most trusted allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. They didn't celebrate, they planned. In the glow of dim light and cigarette smoke, they outlined a new system, a commission that would govern organized crime like a corporate board. No single boss would rule. Every major family would have a seat at the table. Disputes would be mediated, not fought. Territory would be divided logically, not violently. It was a radical concept inspired by both American capitalism and democratic structure. Each family became a branch of the same enterprise, each boss an executive. The commission was the backbone of what would soon be known as La Cosa Nostra, our thing. For Luciano, this wasn't just power, it was purpose. He had done the unthinkable, united an empire through intellect instead of intimidation. He replaced the language of blood with the logic of balance. But deep inside, he knew he had crossed an invisible line. By killing the old dons, he had declared war on tradition itself. He had turned sacred codes into strategic tools. The Mafia would never be the same again. From that point forward, Luciano was no longer just a gangster. He was a statesman of crime, the man who brought modernity to the underworld. The Mafia, once a family-driven secret society, was now an economic system with its own rules, politics, and hierarchy. Still, there was a price. Each betrayal etched itself into his soul. He had built his future upon corpses, men who had trusted him, men who had taught him. In the silence that followed Maranzano's death, Luciano must have known what every revolutionary eventually learns, that every act of creation begins with destruction. As the dawn broke over Manhattan, the city was quiet. The guns were finally silent. For the first time in years, there was order in the chaos. The commission would soon rise, and Lucky Luciano would stand at its center, a man without rivals, without equals. He had killed the kings. Now he would build the kingdom. When the gunfire stopped and the smoke of the Castellammare's war finally lifted, a new world emerged, one sculpted by Lucky Luciano's vision. The Mafia was no longer a scattered collection of feuding street gangs. It had become a corporate machine, and Luciano was its unseen CEO. What he created next would forever blur the line between crime and capitalism. Luciano understood what few gangsters ever had. That power wasn't just about territory, it was about systems. Anyone could control a neighborhood, but to control a city, you needed structure, rules, and a chain of command that made sense. His model was elegant and brutal in its efficiency. He borrowed ideas from American business, boards, departments, dividends, and fused them with the secrecy and loyalty of old-world Mafia codes. At the top sat the commission, the Mafia's governing council, composed of the most powerful family heads. Below them, capo regimes managed crews of soldiers, each responsible for operations in specific territories. Profits flowed upward, protection flowed downward. Disputes were handled internally, quietly, diplomatically. Violence became a last resort, not a strategy. This system transformed organized crime into an institution. And for the first time, Luciano's empire moved beyond street corners and back alleys. It began to infiltrate the legitimate economy. The core of Luciano's genius lay in his approach to business diversification. Prohibition may have made him rich, but he saw its end coming. When alcohol became legal again, the gangs that had built fortunes on bootlegging collapsed overnight. But Luciano had already shifted gears. His empire was built not on one stream of income, but on dozens. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and construction kickbacks. All were integrated into a vast criminal ecosystem that fed the Mafia's treasury. Each venture was managed like a business division, overseen by trusted associates who reported up the ladder. Gambling was the first pillar. Luciano and his partners, Meyer Lansky in particular, saw the future in numbers. They expanded from illegal dice games in Harlem to massive gambling circuits stretching from New York to Florida and Cuba. Luciano's crews supplied the capital. Lansky managed the math, and their network of frontmen made the profits look legitimate. Every casino, every bookie, every racing bet sent a cut to the top. Prostitution became the second pillar, dark, dirty, but incredibly lucrative. Luciano didn't invent the trade, but he industrialized it. Under his reign, hundreds of brothels operated across Manhattan, each one paying tribute to his organization. He established rules to keep the system clean. Women were to be protected from random violence, customers treated fairly, and police bribed regularly. To Luciano, it wasn't about morality, it was about management. Everything could be controlled, organized, monetized. Narcotics, though riskier, offered global reach. Heroin and cocaine moved quietly through shipping routes from Europe and Asia into the United States. Luciano kept his hands clean. He never touched the product directly. Instead, he used middlemen and cutouts, ensuring that if one part of the chain fell, the rest remained intact. It was international business, Mafia style. Then came labor racketeering, perhaps Luciano's most brilliant move. Where others saw factories and unions, he saw opportunity. By controlling dock workers, truckers, and union leaders, Luciano gained leverage over entire industries. If a company refused to cooperate, shipments mysteriously vanished, workers went on strike, and competitors paid the price. Through labor racketeering, Luciano achieved something few gangsters ever had: legitimate influence. Politicians, businessmen, and even judges began to see him not as a thug, but as a fixer, a man who could make problems disappear. He had created a shadow government inside New York's economy, operating with the precision of a multinational corporation. But what truly made Luciano untouchable was how he operated. He didn't flaunt his power, he distributed it. He let others shine, allowed lieutenants like Frank Costello to handle political connections, and trusted Lansky to oversee financial logistics. By decentralizing control, Luciano built a machine that could function even without him. It was the very essence of sustainable crime. Behind this operation was a psychology of control. Luciano believed that fear was useful but limited. It kept people obedient, but it didn't make them loyal. Loyalty, he said, came from respect and shared profit. So he shared the wealth. Soldiers got paid, capos lived well, and the families prospered. Everyone ate, so no one rebelled. Still, beneath the smooth surface of order, corruption spread like wildfire. Luciano's reach extended into city halls, police precincts, and courtrooms. Bribes flowed as easily as wine, and politicians looked the other way. The line between legal and illegal began to vanish. New York wasn't just Luciano's city, it was his company town. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia had become a parallel economy. Every bar, club, and restaurant paid protection money. Every union had a hidden hand guiding it. Every illegal vice funneled cash back into Luciano's accounts. Yet despite the scale, there was almost no chaos. The murders, the wars, the bloodshed, all had been replaced by quiet transactions and silent partnerships. Luciano's rule was subtle but absolute. From his suite at the Waldorf Astoria, he looked more like an executive than a gangster. Tailored suits, clean speech, refined manners. He had transformed from a street hustler into a boardroom strategist. His word was law, but he delivered it with charm. Still, power of this magnitude came with shadows. The very order Luciano had created began to attract attention from journalists, reformers, and the most dangerous opponent of all, the law itself. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless and ambitious crusader, began to see through the illusion of respectability. He suspected that behind every racket, every union, and every casino, there was one name pulling the strings: Charles Lucky Luciano. The empire Luciano built was revolutionary. It turned the Mafia from a knife-fighting brotherhood into a criminal syndicate with a global footprint. But in doing so, Luciano made himself the face of modern organized crime. And that face was now in the crosshairs of justice. The business of crime had reached its golden age, and its golden king was about to face a storm that even he couldn't charm his way out of. As Luciano's empire expanded, so did the web of alliances and rivalries that held it together. The commission had created stability, but it also introduced new layers of politics, where every handshake carried hidden motives and every favor came with cost. The underworld was now a chessboard, and every piece had its ambition. At the center of this web were Luciano's closest allies: Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Bugsy Siegel. Each brought something unique to the table: intelligence, charm, brutality, vision, and together they represented the modern face of organized crime. Yet beneath the surface of unity, small cracks began to appear. Lansky was the brain, the quiet mathematician who understood money better than anyone else. His friendship with Luciano was genuine, built on respect and a shared belief that organized crime could function like Wall Street. Lansky handled international finances, laundered cash through hotels and casinos, and built systems that kept the Mafia's wealth invisible. He was indispensable, but also cautious. He distrusted the volatility of others, especially Genovese. Frank Costello, the prime minister, was the diplomat. He managed the Mafia's connections with politicians, judges, and businessmen. Costello's influence extended far beyond crime. He shaped elections, guided policy, and ensured that the Mafia's interests were protected in City Hall. His power was quiet but immense, a testament to Luciano's belief that soft power could be stronger than violence. Then there was Vito Genovese, Luciano's dark mirror. Where Luciano was refined, Genovese was ruthless. Where Luciano sought balance, Genovese hungered for dominance. He believed that the commission had made the Mafia weak, that too much cooperation had dulled its edge. Genovese admired the old ways of tyranny and blood. He waited patiently, smiling through gritted teeth, for the day he could rule outright. And finally, Bugsy Siegel, the unpredictable one, charismatic, daring, and dangerously impulsive. Siegel was a bridge between Luciano's world and the wild, fast-moving frontier of American expansion. His ventures into Los Angeles and Las Vegas would eventually define the next chapter of organized crime. But in the mid-1930s, he was still the gambler with a gun, loyal but uncontrollable. Luciano's genius was in keeping these volatile personalities balanced. He managed his inner circle like a conductor leading an orchestra, each man powerful, but none allowed to overpower the harmony. It worked for a while. The commission maintained order, profits flowed, and violence was rare. But the peace came with tension. Outside their circle, rival bosses watched with envy and resentment. Men like Albert Anastasia, the brutal head of Murder Incorporated, and Joe Adonis, a cunning Brooklyn operator, thrived under Luciano's system, but secretly dreamed of taking more. The Mafia had become an empire of egos, and every ego wanted its piece of the crown. In the meantime, Luciano's alliances extended beyond Italian borders. He and Lansky forged partnerships with Jewish and Irish gangs, creating a national network of crime that crossed ethnic and geographic lines. It was an unprecedented collaboration, the underworld equivalent of globalization, but also blurred loyalties. When money became the only code, old oaths began to lose meaning. Luciano began to notice subtle shifts. meetings postponed, whispers of discontent, quiet power plays. Genovese, especially, grew bolder. He questioned Luciano's decisions, criticized his diplomacy, and began forming his own alliances. Luciano, ever the strategist, pretended not to notice. He knew that open confrontation would fracture everything he'd built. Instead, he waited and watched, hoping to contain the threat without spilling blood. But trouble was not only internal. Law enforcement was closing in. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey's campaign against organized crime was gaining momentum, and the alliances Luciano had carefully crafted were beginning to strain under pressure. When the system was threatened from outside, old loyalties were tested from within. Luciano had built his empire on trust and profit, but now, both were eroding. Each ally had his own agenda, each rival his own grudge. The network that had once made him invincible was becoming unstable, like a spider web trembling under too much weight. He had created the perfect machine, but even perfect machines have breaking points. And in Luciano's world, the first crack always begins with betrayal. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the peak of his power, a king in everything but name. Yet even as his empire appeared invincible, invisible forces were gathering against him. The era of quiet expansion was ending. A new kind of war was about to begin. Not in the streets, but in the shadows, a hidden war fought through intelligence, betrayal, and the relentless pressure of law. The public still saw Luciano as a charming businessman, a man who attended boxing matches, frequented luxury hotels, and dined with politicians. But behind that polished image, he was running one of the most sophisticated criminal syndicates in American history. His reach extended from the docks of Manhattan to the casinos of Havana. He controlled the unions that unloaded ships, the politicians who passed laws, and the gangsters who enforced his will. It was in many ways the perfect illusion, a world of order masking a system of fear and control. And for years, it worked flawlessly. But perfection always draws attention. And in 1935, one man decided to tear that illusion apart. That man was Thomas E. Dewey, a young, ambitious prosecutor with a taste for justice and headlines. Dewey understood that the Mafia couldn't be defeated by bullets or raids. It had to be dismantled from within by targeting the man at the top. And to do that, he would expose the underworld's most guarded secret, its connection to the sex trade. Luciano had always known prostitution was dangerous business. Too many people involved, too many mouths to feed, too many chances for betrayal. But it was also profitable beyond measure. His lieutenant, Johnny Torrio, had once told him that vice would always outlive law. Luciano believed him. He saw prostitution not as filth, but as a franchise, organized, standardized, controlled. Women were assigned to brothels, madams paid protection, and police officers received envelopes of cash. It was, in Luciano's words, the business that never sleeps. But Dewey was determined to wake it up. His investigators began raiding brothels across Manhattan, interrogating hundreds of women. Most kept silent, terrified of Mafia retribution. Then, finally, one spoke, a madam named Klein, who revealed that the entire city's prostitution network was managed by Luciano's men. Her testimony became the crack in the armor. Still, Luciano remained calm. He believed that money could silence any storm. He ordered lawyers, bribed cops, and kept his meetings discreet. But Dewey was no ordinary enemy. He didn't care for bribes. He wanted something bigger, a public victory, a moral crusade that would make him a national hero. And to reach that goal, he needed to destroy Lucky Luciano. The raids intensified. Hundreds of women were arrested. Many broke down under interrogation. They described a sprawling system that connected every brothel, every pimp, and every payoff to Luciano's organization. Dewey's men built charts, traced payments, and mapped connections. Slowly, piece by piece, the invisible network took shape, and at its center stood one name. Luciano's allies warned him that the net was closing. Lansky urged him to flee to Cuba, to lay low until the heat cooled. Genovese, ever opportunistic, whispered that perhaps it was time to let someone else handle things in New York. But Luciano refused to run. To flee would mean weakness, and weakness was death in his world. "I made this city mine," he said. "I'll die before I leave it." Behind closed doors, however, paranoia began to grow. Luciano knew that Dewey's investigation was too precise to be luck. Someone inside his circle was talking. Every week brought new arrests, new witnesses, new leaks. His empire, once built on silence, was now echoing with the sound of betrayal. To counter Dewey's assault, Luciano tried to fight intelligence with intelligence. He used his connections in the police department to learn which raids were coming and when. He ordered his men to relocate brothels, destroy records, and threaten witnesses. But the damage was already done. The hidden war had shifted in Dewey's favor, not because he was stronger, but because the public was on his side. Newspapers splashed Luciano's name across headlines. Vice King of New York, the man behind the brothels. The myth of the elegant businessman began to crumble. To the public, he was no longer the silent ruler of organized crime. He was a symbol of moral decay. Politicians who had once shaken his hand now turned their backs. Judges who had accepted his bribes suddenly found their consciences. And still, the real betrayal was yet to come. In 1936, Dewey's team arrested Luciano's closest lieutenants, including his personal bodyguards and financial handlers. Faced with decades in prison, some began to talk. They told prosecutors how the money flowed, who collected it, and who approved the payments. They spoke of Luciano's meetings, his orders, his women. The walls were closing in, not from police raids, but from the mouths of men who once swore loyalty for life. Luciano's world was collapsing quietly, piece by piece, not through open warfare, but through exposure. The same order that had made him powerful was now his weakness. Every record, every transaction, every layer of control left a trail. The modern empire he had built was too visible to hide. In April 1936, Dewey made his move. Armed with testimony, ledgers, and a wave of publicity, he issued an arrest warrant for Charles Lucky Luciano. It was a stunning blow. The most powerful man in organized crime, wanted for compulsory prostitution. To the public, it was justice. To Luciano, it was betrayal from within his own house. The hidden war was over. The law had won not with bullets, but with information. And Luciano, who once ruled the underworld with intellect and charm, was about to face a different kind of enemy. A courtroom filled with witnesses who would speak his empire into ruin. The morning of April 1st, 1936, began like any other in New York City. Taxis honked, newspapers fluttered through the streets, and the skyline shimmered in the first light of spring. But inside the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a quiet storm was brewing. Lucky Luciano, the man who ruled America's underworld from the comfort of his luxury suite, was about to face the most decisive moment of his life. The invisible empire he had spent a decade building was on the brink of collapse. That morning, Luciano received word that Thomas E. Dewey had issued an arrest warrant bearing his name. Charles Lucky Luciano, charged with orchestrating and profiting from a vast prostitution racket. At first, he didn't believe it. "They can't touch me," he said calmly, lighting a cigarette. For years, Luciano had bribed judges, bought politicians, and silenced witnesses. To him, the law was just another game, and he was its undefeated player. But this time, the board had changed. Within hours, the headlines hit the streets. Vice are hunted by Dewey, Luciano indicted. The illusion of invincibility cracked. For the first time, the public saw Lucky Luciano not as a businessman, not as a mysterious benefactor, but as a criminal, one who had turned women into currency and crime into an industry. Dewey had struck where it hurt most: reputation. Luciano vanished from the Waldorf that afternoon. With the help of his associates, he fled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a resort town famous for its thermal baths, gambling dens, and political corruption, a perfect refuge for a man like him. There, under the name Charles Ross, he took rooms at the Arlington Hotel, living quietly while his lawyers prepared a defense and his allies scrambled to bribe whoever they could. But Dewey was relentless. He reached beyond New York's borders, coordinating with federal agents and Arkansas police. When Dewey's men finally located Luciano, they moved swiftly. On April 3, 1936, in the middle of the day, detectives stormed the Arlington Hotel lobby. Luciano was arrested without resistance, impeccably dressed, calm, and cold. When asked if he was Lucky Luciano, he simply smiled and said, "You've got me mixed up with somebody else." But everyone knew the most powerful mob boss in America had just been captured. The extradition process was immediate and humiliating. Dewey wanted to make a point. No man, no matter how rich or feared, stood above the law. Luciano was flown back to New York under heavy guard, cameras flashing at every airport stop. By the time he arrived, his empire was already shaking. Politicians distanced themselves, racketeers fled the city, and the commission, the very council he had created, began to consider survival without him. Luciano's arrest set off a chain reaction within the Mafia. Old rivals saw opportunity in his fall. Vito Genovese began whispering to other bosses that maybe it was time for new leadership. Frank Costello, ever the politician, tried to stabilize the network, but the fear was palpable. Without Luciano's authority, the unity he had forced upon the underworld began to unravel. While Dewey built his case, Luciano remained in jail, confident he could still manipulate the outcome. He used his money and charm to ensure comfortable accommodations, fine food, tailored clothes, a radio in his cell. But comfort couldn't hide the growing dread. Witness after witness began to testify, each one a nail in the coffin of his defense. The testimonies painted a chilling portrait. Luciano wasn't just aware of the prostitution racket. He commanded it. Madams described meetings where his lieutenants collected payments, where orders came from the top. One woman broke down on the stand, saying she had been beaten for missing her payments. Another claimed Luciano's men threatened her family if she didn't comply. Whether the stories were true or not, the damage was irreversible. Dewey presented his case with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't focus on sensationalism. He focused on systems. Charts and ledgers showed how money flowed from the brothels to Luciano's accounts. Bank records, phone calls, coded notes. Every piece of evidence was a brick in the wall closing around him. Dewey's strategy was brilliant. To prove that Luciano's so-called business model was indistinguishable from organized crime. Luciano's lawyers fought back fiercely, arguing that the witnesses were unreliable, that no direct evidence linked him personally to the brothels. He's a gambler, not a pimp, they argued. He's being tried for who he is, not what he did. But the tide of public opinion had already turned. The newspapers adored Dewey, the clean-cut prosecutor taking down the crime kingpin. As the trial progressed, Luciano's composure began to erode. In private, he raged at the betrayal. He knew the testimonies came from frightened women, but he also knew someone in his organization had guided Dewey's hand. Someone close had given the prosecutor the map. The most likely suspect was Genovese, who had every motive to see him fall. But in the Mafia, suspicion was poison. Luciano couldn't confront anyone. He could only wait and hope. In June 1936, after a 6-week trial, the verdict came down. The jury deliberated for only 7 hours before returning with their decision. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The courtroom erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, Dewey shaking hands with his team. Luciano sat still, his face expressionless. When the judge pronounced his sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, the weight of it finally hit. For a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had survived wars, betrayals, and assassination plots, it was not the violence that broke him. It was confinement. The king of the underworld was now a prisoner, caged by the very system he thought he controlled. As guards led him away, he turned to a reporter and said quietly, "Tell them I'll be back." But deep down, he knew the truth. The fall had begun long before his arrest. It had started the moment he believed he was untouchable. In the months that followed, the empire he had built began to splinter. Genovese positioned himself as acting boss. Costello tried to preserve order, and Lansky kept the financial networks alive. Yet without Luciano's guiding hand, the balance faltered. The commission survived, but the unity of vision, that cold, calculated brilliance, was gone. Behind bars, Luciano remained a legend. But legends don't rule empires. They haunt them. Luciano's life inside Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, known grimly as Little Siberia, was a stark contrast to his days at the Waldorf Astoria. Gone were the silk suits, private chauffeurs, and lavish dinners. In their place came the cold clang of metal doors, the scratch of rough wool uniforms, and the endless monotony of prison life. For a man who had once commanded the underworld with a single phone call, confinement was the cruelest punishment imaginable. At first, Luciano tried to adapt. He played cards, smoked when he could, and stayed polite with guards who treated him as a curiosity more than a threat. Even in prison, he maintained an aura of command. The other inmates called him Boss Charlie. They knew he was no ordinary criminal. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who still held invisible power. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Luciano's mind never stopped working. His network on the outside continued to function, thanks largely to Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. Costello managed the political contacts and business fronts, keeping cash flowing through casinos and unions. Lansky, ever the strategist, handled the finances with surgical precision, ensuring that Luciano's fortune didn't vanish under government scrutiny. Even from behind bars, Luciano received coded messages about profits, operations, and betrayals, updates smuggled in through lawyers and visitors. But prison also gave him time to reflect. For the first time since his teenage years, Luciano had no deals to make, no meetings to attend, no wars to fight. He began to think about the price of power, the friends buried, the women lost, the constant fear that tomorrow might bring an assassin's bullet. He had risen higher than anyone in the Mafia's history, yet he now lived in a 6x8 cell. In his quiet moments, he admitted to himself that maybe Dewey hadn't destroyed him. Maybe he had destroyed himself. Still, he refused to show weakness. When journalists asked if he regretted anything, he smirked and said, "Only getting caught." It was part bravado, part truth. Luciano had built his empire on the belief that emotion was a liability. But even he couldn't hide the sting of watching others control what he had once ruled. The world outside was changing. By the late 1930s, Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, was growing closer to Mussolini's fascist regime, using his influence to expand the Mafia's power overseas. Meanwhile, Costello's political empire in New York grew stronger, fueled by his connections to judges and city officials. Luciano was both proud and wary. The empire he'd built was thriving, but it was evolving without him. In 1940, he received an unexpected visit from a reporter who asked him whether he still considered himself the boss of bosses. Luciano chuckled and replied, "There's no such thing as a boss of bosses. We're all just businessmen, some with better lawyers." The remark was a subtle jab at Dewey, but it also reflected a new awareness. Luciano knew that his legend had outgrown him. The world saw him as a myth, a symbol of organized crime itself. And myths, he realized, never die, they transform. Inside the prison, Luciano found small ways to exert control. He arranged for better food, got special privileges for certain inmates, and quietly built influence over the guards. Money still talked, even in Dannemora. Soon, rumors spread that Luciano had more freedom than any prisoner in the facility, that he could host card games, receive fine cigars, even have meals prepared specially for him. The warden denied it, but everyone knew the truth. Luciano was still a boss, even in chains. Yet, as war clouds gathered over Europe, the future took a strange turn. The United States would soon enter World War II, and the Navy faced a growing problem: enemy sabotage along the docks of New York Harbor. Rumors spread that German agents were sinking American ships, and the authorities feared infiltration along the waterfront. The docks, however, were controlled by one group, the Mafia. It was Meyer Lansky who first suggested a bold idea: use Luciano's influence to protect the ports. Through his network, Lansky approached military intelligence officers, hinting that Luciano could ensure cooperation from longshoremen and dock workers in exchange for certain considerations. The government was skeptical at first, but as ships continued to explode mysteriously, desperation grew. Eventually, a secret arrangement was made, one that would later be known as Operation Underworld. From his prison cell, Lucky Luciano suddenly became an asset to the U.S. government. He ordered his contacts in the docks to maintain strict discipline, eliminate any saboteurs, and assist naval intelligence with information. Within weeks, the incident stopped. Whether it was because of Luciano's intervention or coincidence remains debated, but to the Navy, the results spoke for themselves. For the first time in years, Luciano saw a glimmer of opportunity. His cooperation had given him leverage, a bargaining chip for freedom. Though he remained officially a prisoner, he began to receive visitors from military intelligence and political figures, all eager to thank him for his patriotic service. It was an irony that amused him deeply. The same government that had called him the Lord of Crime now relied on him to protect the nation. By the time the war ended in 1945, Luciano had spent nearly a decade behind bars. He was older, heavier, and more introspective, but not defeated. Operation Underworld had changed everything. It had made him useful again, and usefulness was power. He knew that soon, someone in the system would want to repay the favor. Luciano's rise from the streets of Lower Manhattan had always been about survival, turning weakness into strength, chaos into opportunity. Prison had not broken that instinct. It had refined it, and though his cell door still locked every night, deep inside, he could feel it. His next move was already unfolding. In 1946, the unthinkable happened. Charles Lucky Luciano was released from prison. Officially, it was a deportation, not a pardon. Governor Dewey, the same man who had destroyed him a decade earlier, agreed to commute his sentence in recognition of Luciano's wartime cooperation. Unofficially, it was a trade, freedom for silence, influence for exile. Luciano walked out of Dannemora prison after nearly 10 years behind bars, no longer an inmate, but not truly a free man either. His destination, Italy. As the ship carrying him crossed the Atlantic, Luciano stood at the railing, staring at the endless horizon. For the first time since his youth, he was leaving the country he had helped shape from the shadows. America had made him powerful, and then cast him out. Yet, even in exile, Luciano refused to see himself as finished. "They can take me out of America," he told a journalist later, "but they can't take America out of me." When he arrived in Naples, he was greeted not by friends, but by Italian police and plainclothes American agents. They shadowed his every move, photographing him in cafes, following him through the narrow alleys of the city. The Allies feared he might rebuild his empire in Europe. In truth, that was exactly what he intended. Naples was poor and broken after the war, a place of black markets, smuggling, and desperation. To Luciano, it looked familiar. Opportunity was everywhere. He quickly established himself in a luxury hotel suite, turning it into an informal headquarters. Former mob associates visited from New York and Cuba, carrying messages, cash, and loyalty. Luciano began to reassert control over international narcotics trafficking, using Italy as a hub, France as the processor, and America as the market. This would become the infamous French connection, a pipeline that would dominate the heroin trade for decades. But it wasn't just business. Luciano longed for connection to his old world, the streets, the voices, the pulse of New York. He began coordinating meetings with Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese, who had returned from Italy to reclaim power. Together, they discussed the next evolution of organized crime: casinos in Havana, gambling operations in Las Vegas, and political investments that would outlive any single dawn. Though technically in exile, Luciano's words still carried weight. Then came Havana, 1946, a moment that would seal his legend. The world's most powerful mobsters gathered in Cuba for what became known as the Havana Conference, organized under the guise of a business summit. Luciano arrived quietly by ship, using bribed officials to evade detection. When he entered the grand ballroom of the Hotel Nacional, every major figure in organized crime stood to greet him. They called him boss. It was a coronation of sorts, the exiled king returning to his throne. At the conference, Luciano outlined his vision for the Mafia's future. No single leader, but a board, a commission, that would ensure stability and prevent wars. Each family would share power, profits, and peace. The idea wasn't new. He had created it years earlier. But now it was reborn on a global scale. His speech reminded them that greed and ego had nearly destroyed the Mafia once. The only way forward was organization, a criminal democracy of sorts. For a few brief months, it seemed Luciano had reclaimed his empire. The Havana casinos buzzed with American money, and his influence stretched from New York to Naples. But success brought attention. U.S. intelligence discovered his presence in Cuba and demanded his removal. Under pressure, the Cuban government forced Luciano to return to Italy. Once again, his empire dissolved into smoke. Back in Naples, his health began to decline. Years of stress, prison food, and heavy smoking took their toll. Yet, he remained sharp, corresponding with friends and managing his network quietly. Younger gangsters still sought his advice. They came to him not for orders, but for wisdom. Luciano had become something more than a mob boss. He was a symbol, the architect of modern organized crime, the man who had turned chaos into order. Despite the isolation, Luciano found a strange peace in his later years. He walked the streets of Naples anonymously, sometimes buying espresso at a corner cafe where no one recognized him. The ambition that had once burned so fiercely had cooled into reflection. He knew he would never return to America, but perhaps that was justice. "I made the rules," he once said, "and I paid for them." Still, even in exile, he couldn't escape the game. The narcotics routes he helped establish continued to expand, enriching syndicates worldwide. The American Mafia flourished under his design, disciplined, structured, nearly invisible. Luciano's absence had not weakened the system. It had perfected it. By the mid-1950s, law enforcement agencies across 2 continents still viewed him as a threat. The Italian government placed him under surveillance, yet no concrete charges stuck. To the end, Lucky Luciano remained untouchable, a ghost of the old world who could still move nations through whispers. And though he would never again walk the streets of New York, his shadow lingered there. In every union deal, casino floor, and whispered meeting between men who owed their power to the man who built the Mafia's future. The final chapter of Lucky Luciano's life unfolded far from the roaring streets of New York or the glittering casinos of Havana. In Naples, amid the crumbling grandeur of post-war Italy, the once mighty crime lord lived like a ghost, half revered, half forgotten. The man who had once commanded the most sophisticated criminal empire in American history now spent his days in a modest apartment near the Bay of Naples, waking early, drinking espresso at a corner cafe, and reading American newspapers smuggled in through friends. He was still lucky, but luck had changed its meaning. To the locals, he was just Senior Lucania, a quiet, well-dressed man with sharp eyes and impeccable manners. But behind that calm facade lay the restless mind of a man who had reshaped the underworld. Even in exile, Luciano remained in contact with the criminal world. Through coded letters and discreet intermediaries, he advised syndicates across continents, not for money, but to maintain relevance, to prove that his empire still lived on through others. His body, however, was failing him. Years of smoking, stress, and prison had weakened his heart. Yet there was an irony to his old age. The Mafia that once operated in secrecy had now become institutionalized, normalized, even glamorous. Hollywood began romanticizing the mobster image that Luciano had pioneered in real life. Films like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy turned gangsters into cultural icons, echoing the myth of men like him. Luciano would sometimes laugh bitterly at these portrayals, telling visitors, "They make it look easy, but they forget every crown comes soaked in blood." Still, Luciano couldn't resist trying one last grand plan. In the late 1950s, he attempted to broker a deal with Hollywood producers who wanted to make a movie about his life. He envisioned a film that would portray him not as a criminal, but as a visionary, the man who brought order to chaos. To Luciano, it was a chance to rewrite his story, to control how the world would remember him. But the project quickly drew attention from law enforcement. Both the U.S. and Italian governments feared that the film would glorify organized crime. The FBI even sent agents to monitor the negotiations, suspecting that the movie was merely a front for re-establishing international smuggling routes. At the same time, Luciano found himself surrounded by ghosts of the past. Meyer Lansky was in Cuba, still operating casinos under Batista's regime. Frank Costello was fading in New York, replaced by a new generation of mobsters who lacked the old code of honor. Vito Genovese, his former ally turned rival, had grown powerful, but his ambition had turned paranoid, eventually landing him in prison. The empire Luciano had built was still standing, but its new rulers were colder, greedier, and less disciplined. The world he created was evolving beyond him. Despite it all, Luciano still held influence. Younger gangsters in Italy and America treated him like a living legend. They came to him seeking guidance, and he often preached restraint, an irony, given the blood he had once spilled. If you want to live long in this business, he would say, learn when not to move. To them, he was a teacher, a strategist, almost a philosopher of power. But to himself, he was a man haunted by memories, of lost friends, of choices made in youth, and of a dream that had devoured its creator. On January 26, 1962, Luciano was waiting at the Naples airport for an important meeting. A film producer from Rome was arriving, the same man with whom he hoped to finalize the deal about his biography. Luciano looked immaculate as always, a gray suit, polished shoes, and his trademark fedora. He had even brought along press clippings from America, ready to discuss how he wanted his story told. But fate had other plans. Moments after greeting the producer, Luciano suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. Witnesses said he fell without a sound, his hat rolling away across the terminal floor. By the time medics arrived, Lucky Luciano was dead of a heart attack at age 64. Ironically, the police who had spent years trying to catch him arrived too late. Not to arrest him, but to guard his body. They found in his pockets a list of phone numbers, a small notebook, and a pack of American cigarettes. Within hours, news of his death spread across the world. Newspapers called him the man who built the American Mafia, while others described him as the genius of organized crime. In New York, old associates raised glasses in his memory. In Rome, officials sighed in relief. Luciano's body was returned to America, the only way he was allowed to go home. Thousands of people lined the streets of East Harlem for his funeral. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity. Among the crowd were men who owed their entire fortunes to his vision. They stood silently as his coffin passed, knowing that an era had ended. In the end, Lucky Luciano got what few gangsters ever do, a legacy. His empire had outlived him. His ideas had reshaped crime across continents. He had turned the Mafia into a system, one that functioned long after its founder's heart stopped beating. As one journalist wrote in his obituary, Luciano didn't just play the game, he rewrote the rules. And so, the man who once ruled the underworld died, not in violence, but in quiet irony, a visionary trapped in his own myth. In his death, as in his life, Lucky Luciano remained what he had always been, a paradox of brilliance and corruption, loyalty and betrayal. The man who built the Mafia's future, only to be exiled from it. In the end, the story of Lucky Luciano is not merely a tale of crime. It is the story of a man who rewrote the architecture of power. His life moved like a cinematic arc, from a poor Sicilian immigrant boy on the streets of New York to the architect of the American underworld, to an aging exile staring at the sea in Naples. The rise, the the empire, the exile. Each stage revealed a different truth about ambition, loyalty, and the price of control. The closing scene of Luciano's life feels strangely poetic. He died at an airport, a place of departures and arrivals, symbolizing the endless motion that defined his existence. He had spent his life moving between worlds, between legality and crime, between Italy and America, between myth and man. Even in death, he stood at a threshold, suspended between two identities that never fully reconciled. What makes Luciano's story endure is not just the magnitude of his crimes, but the psychology behind them. He wasn't driven by bloodlust or chaos, but by an obsessive need to impose order. Where others saw the Mafia as a collection of violent gangs, Luciano saw a system, something that could be structured, disciplined, and sustained like a government. His genius was administrative, not emotional. He replaced fear with functionality, turning loyalty into a contract and betrayal into policy. In a sense, he transformed criminal instinct into corporate logic long before the world coined the term organized crime. Yet, every system built on human ambition eventually turns on itself. Luciano's empire, so carefully designed, outgrew him, became corrupted by greed, and evolved into something he no longer recognized. The organization he had built to prevent chaos was consumed by it, proving that even the most brilliant structures cannot tame the darker instincts of human nature. His life serves as a timeless paradox. The man who brought order to the underworld could not bring peace to his own soul. As decades passed, his myth grew. Films, books, and documentaries resurrected him, each one shaping a different version of Lucky Luciano, the ruthless mastermind, the tragic exile, the pragmatic genius. In pop culture, he became an archetype, the original Godfather, the blueprint for cinematic dons who came after him. But behind the charisma and cunning was something more fragile, a man who wanted to be respected, remembered, and understood. His deepest fear was not death, but irrelevance. In his final years, Luciano once told a confidant, "I built something that will last forever. Maybe that's my punishment." It was an eerily prophetic statement. The Mafia he organized became an institution that endured far beyond its founder. Even as governments, prosecutors, and modern policing dismantled its visible power, its influence lingered in politics, unions, and corporate crime. The hierarchy, the silent codes, the language of loyalty, all traces of his vision. But perhaps the most haunting legacy Luciano left was philosophical. His life posed uncomfortable questions. Where does order end and corruption begin? How different are the men in suits from the men in the shadows? Luciano blurred that line so effectively that the Mafia became a mirror of legitimate power. His empire exposed the uncomfortable truth that systems, whether criminal or corporate, thrive on the same principles: discipline, secrecy, and the manipulation of trust. Even now, more than half a century after his death, his shadow remains. In New York, the streets where he once ruled are unrecognizable, yet his name still echoes and whispers among historians and storytellers. His portrait appears in museums, his strategies in academic studies, his legend in film scripts. For a man exiled, silenced, and buried, Luciano achieved what few men ever do: immortality. And perhaps that is the final irony. Lucky Luciano sought control over everything: his business, his men, his destiny. But in the end, it was the story of Lucky Luciano that controlled him. The myth devoured the man. What began as a quest for power became a parable about the nature of it. How every empire, no matter how brilliant, is built on human fragility. The camera of history closes on him not as a monster or a hero, but as both a visionary criminal who understood people better than he understood himself. The last image is not of violence or triumph, but of reflection. An old man on a balcony in Naples, cigarette in hand, watching the sea he once crossed to change the world. His empire crumbled. His enemies died. His allies vanished. But his vision, cold, brilliant, and unapologetically human, endured. Because Lucky Luciano didn't just build the Mafia's future. He built a mirror to our own, one that still reflects the timeless truth that power, in any form, always comes at a price.